Hello everyone. Welcome to the second of our 2023 Music Industry Insight sessions. If you weren't with us last week and haven't watched the previous video, then last week we covered some basics in terms of getting release ready. So when you've kind of, you're looking to release your music, what are the best things to have in place to get yourself ready to make the most of it? Today's session is sort of adjacent to that, really. So it's kind of on the basis that you are writing, performing music, recording, releasing music, and basically going to run through some of the kind of formal structures that are in place that basically enable you to derive revenue from your music. Basically, how you get paid, and looking at some of the bodies, some of the stakeholders that are that enable you to do that. For those of you who, a few people on this call who will know, like, something I'm quite passionate about, it's all there for artists, performers, songwriters to kind of collect. But unfortunately, it's one of the things where the more work we do with Launchpad, the more we discover people aren't kind of collecting everything that is eligible to them. So hopefully you find this session informative, and hopefully, we can help you in some shape or form. So, as I mentioned, this is the second session that we're doing as part of this series. Last week's was getting release ready. We've got 3 more weeks after this week. So next week, we'll be handing over to Jazz from Hanglands PR, and she's going to be talking about how to promote yourself and your music. And then in a couple of weeks' time, we're going to talk about funding, getting additional funding for your project. And then finally in August, we have another session around getting out there and playing live and how to approach promoters or put on your own events and things like that. So again, if you're not aware, if you've not come across me before, my name is Whiskas, or my real name is Sam, and I'm the director of Music Leads and run the Launchpad project. I'm also the program leader for the Music Industries Management course at Leeds Beckett University, which I do part-time, which it actually really helps when we're doing sessions like this, because I'm constantly having to update the information and get it all right. I also work with a number of other organisations, so PRS Foundation, Help Musicians and Youth Music. I'm very privileged to work with them, where if you, when it comes to the funding session that we do, I'm often asked to be an advisor when it comes to their funding decisions and panels. And again, kind of some of the reasons that I've ended up coming round to doing all of this is I have previously been a musician, I think relatively successful. We got to tour the world, record a couple of albums, had a few successful records. One of the records was on my own record label that I founded, which went on to sell 500,000 records across the artist roster. I've also worked putting on live gigs. I've worked as a record producer. And done my had a little bit of involvement in artist management as well. So I had a bit of involvement in all kind of different aspects, and tried to now sort of trying to pass that knowledge on to other people, really. So today, maximizing your royalties. How are we going to do this? So this is really the structure of what I'm going to go through today. We're going to talk about where the royalties come from. So why are royalties, I suppose, split up in the way that they are. That mainly will come across around how we split the difference between the royalties that are involved in recordings versus compositions, and I'll explain a bit more about that. That'll lead us touching on kind of the 3 main kind of public body distribution bodies for different kinds of royalties. So we're talking about performing royalties, mechanical royalties, and neighbouring rights. We'll touch on how all the different kind of royalties work when you're working with third parties. So traditionally that would be if you're working with a record label, or even now commonly working with distributions, companies or distributors, digital aggregators. But also when it comes to your publishing royalties, what that means in terms of working with publishing companies, and the kind of prevalence of kind of publishing administration arms as well. So what do we mean by music royalties? Well, music creators and music rights holders, as we call them, they make money in multiple ways, depending on where the music is played and performed. The important thing to remember is, if you are a music creator, You are the original owner of a piece of musical work. So you have to proactively grant somebody else the license for somebody else to monetize it, shall we say? But I say that because most of the time you have to license it to somebody else in order to generate revenue. You have to license it to. There'll be names that you're familiar with, like the PRS, like your distributors. You have to kind of give over some kind of permission for somebody else to use your work, really, in order to generate those income. And I'll explain a bit about how that works throughout today, really. When we talk about musical work, if we think of a record, for example, a recording, if going off last week's session, we talk about getting release ready and you're coming to release a record, there are actually two separate copyrights in that recording. There is the recording itself. So that is you think about that recording, that involves a set specific group of musicians who recorded generally in traditionally maybe in one studio at one period of time. And that's finalized and that's sort of set to record, right? And then there is the song, and the song could have been written by different people or a different combination of people or by more of some people than other people. So those two things essentially get treated differently. And again, it's often helpful to think of it in terms of, doing a cover of somebody else's song. The recordings have one set of stakeholders and the songs and the composition have another, even though they could be exactly the same. The other example is an electronic music producer who writes and records a song completely on his laptop, like I would do here. Well, yes, there is the copyright owner is that person, but the copyrights are treated differently because there is one for the recording and one for the compositions. And I will come back to this throughout this session because it is the thing that kind of underpins the way in which royalties flow within the music industry. So songs and compositions. So taking this first, when anyone writes a song, you are immediately the owner of that song, that piece of copyrights, that piece of intellectual property. If you are doing it solo, then obviously it's pretty simple. You on your own, you wrote that song, you have that piece of IP, you have the right to do stuff with that piece of copyright. If it's a combination of you, then we won't touch on this too much today, but that is up for the group of you to negotiate what percentage you have. So you might be familiar with the idea of song splits, but it's up to you really to decide that. There isn't too much of a formula. There are frameworks for splitting it up, but really it is up to you to decide. Moving on to recordings. So as I've already said, when you make a recording, you also create a piece of intellectual property, a copyright, the recording copyright. Now, the difference here is that it's basically whoever convened, arranged for the recording, the person who basically paid for the recording owns that. Now, this is where it becomes a little bit different to compositions because, of course, it's not always the performers who pay for the recording. In fact, this is where a traditional record deal comes into play because under a traditional record deal model, the record company pays for the performers to go into the studio. Therefore, in law, they are the owners of that recording. And it's assumed that the performers have their own contract for how they're going to get paid for the record sales, so to speak, which again, as it says here, we'll cover later. And I think the thing the important thing to bear in mind with this is that if someone is inviting you to record with them and it's seen as a favor, that is essentially murky ground when it comes to ownership. If you have paid for the recording, then it's pretty clear. But if you're recording with someone for a favor or it feels like it's free time, it's always best to go into those scenarios with a clear ask of, well, who ends up as the rights holder at the end of that. Again, if anyone is paying for an artist to do it, it is worth being clear around who ends up as the recording copyright owner. And as I said, it's worth thinking of that in the traditional respect of like a record label and a performing artist. Someone's paying for it, then they're taking the kind of record label approach to it. That they're that stakeholder really, whether they are a traditional record label or not. Okay, so I've mentioned the word stakeholder quite a lot even so far. And I suppose that's because, as we've seen, there are performers, there are the rights holder for recordings, there are songwriters. All these are the sort of named stakeholders when it comes to a piece of music, and specifically a piece of recorded music. And we mainly break them down, really, even though we break it down into those three that I just said, really: the master rights holder, the performers, and the songwriters. And again, using our example of a solo electronic artist who's just on their laptop, like I am here, that person would be all three of those things. But the important thing to understand within the music industry is that the rights are all treated slightly differently, and they're certainly all the royalties are certainly distributed in different ways for each role. And it's one of the things that makes managing your royalties a little bit complicated, because if you are all three, and most emerging artists are all three, you have to think as each different one to make sure that you're collecting all the royalties appropriately. And separate to those three stakeholders, there are three main ways in which that income is generated as well. So the first one is sales, which is what most people will be coming to. It's quite hard not to get paid for sales. As soon as you distribute your music, you would get money back in sales. Then there is broadcast, and this is the first one that people are generally familiar with, which is when your music is broadcast to an audience, to the public. So when it's played on radio, when it's played live. And the final one that is sometimes overlooked is duplication, where copies are made of your music. And I'll go through a bit more detail about what each of these means shortly. So in order to collect the income due for all of these, and this is something that we'll come back to over the duration of the conversation, is there are 5 income streams. So if you write, perform, record your own original music, and you're playing it live, and it's getting played on the radio, and it's on streaming services, there are 5 ways in which you need to collect your income, and they're all slightly independent of each other. The first one is recording royalties. So like I said, that's your sales income. If you are distributing your music through a DistroKid or a CD Baby, that's what I mean by that. That's the income that comes through that. Then there are your performer royalties that come through PPL, your neighbouring rights, and they're split into 2. One's for the performer and one's for the rights holder. I'll break all of these down through the rest of the call. Then there's the performing royalties through PRS that's related to songwriting, and the mechanical royalties that are related to duplication through MCPS. And actually, this is just there as something to refer to, because I'll go through all of these in more detail throughout the rest of the talk. So a few examples for you. Taking it old school first, okay? So if you were going to sell a physical record in a shop, so you've made a CD and you want to sell it, let's give the example that you're selling it in the local HMV, or if you're in Leeds, you're selling it on Jumbo. You could place that directly in that shop, and the shop then pays you back a percentage, and that is your royalty, that is your recording royalty, that's your sales income. Or you could be doing it through a record label or distributor. They will get that, and then they would pay the artist a royalty. That is a typical situation, and that is how the performers get paid. That is how the people who perform on the record and the rights holder of the record get paid. The songwriters get paid at an earlier stage in this example. So this is where MCPS comes into play. So when a record is pressed, the rights holder has an obligation to pay a mechanical license, which is where the income goes back to the songwriters and the publishers and their publisher. Now, generally, if you are the master rights holder and the songwriter, this step doesn't happen. But for example, if you wanted to do a Beatles covers album, that is how the Beatles would derive income from you having done that. Okay. Second example is the more common example of streaming. So your music being on Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Tidal, etc. So some of you will probably already be doing this kind of work, and you will have worked with a distributor or maybe a record label to get your get your music onto those services. So those streaming services pay 82% of the total pie to the distributor and the record label, and then they pay the artist a royalty amount after commission. Now, if you've paid a fee to a distributor, you're probably getting all of this chunk. If you're working with a record label, you might only be getting 50% of that chunk as a royalty. It can all depend on the deal you have with your distributor or record label. The point about this is, as the performer, you're only getting 82% of this total pie, because the other 18% is going to the songwriters. And it's going to the songwriter through two different paths. Half of it is going to PRS, which is the performing royalties, and half of it is going to the MCPS, which is for duplication. So again, the point to make out of this is, if you're the performers, the record label, and the songwriters, there are three different routes to collecting all the money that is generated through streaming. And ultimately, if you're the songwriters and you're not signed up to PRS and MCPS, you are missing out on 18% of the total income that is coming out of the streaming services for your music. Finally, if your music is, ignore the little bit that says BBC Sounds there, I'll come back to that in a second. If your music is getting played on the radio or on TV. Now, all broadcast systems have to pay a PRS license every year to be able to use your music. That's what you do, and I'll come back to this in a minute. That's what you do when your music is when you sign up to PRS. You're basically giving the BBC the license to use your music whenever they want, with a fee attached to it. So you're probably already aware, when your music gets played on radio, you get PRS income, and that is how it works. Now we'll refer to BBC Sounds. So since listening to radio on playback, so like not live, has become such a big thing, that has been judged as a duplication. So you remember I was saying there's three things earlier: there's sales, there's broadcast, and there's duplication. So obviously your music getting played on radio is a broadcast, but you listening to it the next day on BBC Sounds is classed as a duplication, which means that there's also the generation of royalties that get paid out through MCPS. For the first time here, we're going to introduce PPL, which is the body, the organisation that pays out to the performers and the rights holders. So up until now, when it's broadcast, performers and rights holders when music is broadcast. So up till now, we've been, like with the Spotify model, we looked at PRS and MCPS that went to the songwriters. So in this model of radio, we just talked about how the songwriters are getting paid, and this bit over on my right is PPL, is how the performers and the rights holders in the recording get paid. So again, just like a PRS amount gets generated for radio play, so does a PPL amount, of which half goes to the performers and half goes to the master rights holders. Okay. So the one bit missing in this example is sales. There's no sales income when your music is played on the radio. And again, the key thing to remember about this is, I said there's five ways in which you get paid, one of which is sales. Sales isn't there. This is four different ways in which you get paid from radio play: PRS, MCPS, PPL as performer, and PPL as master rights holder, if you are all those things. You could equally be only one of those things, and you have to kind of tie it out. Okay, so yeah, this slide just reinforces everything I've been saying so far, right? Even if you own your own recordings, are a solo performer, and write your own songs, you need to be aware of each of these different five routes and be able to kind of sign up to all the right things to be able to claim all your income. You might just be one of those. There might be people on this call who are interested in setting up a record label, and that one bit that's master rights holders will be relevant to them. You might be a songwriter who doesn't perform. Again, it's worth knowing that those bits of income are there for you. We know that a lot of people who come to us as Launchpad kind of are all of these things, which is why I speak in such a generalized way. So yeah, ultimately, hopefully you get some idea of those five routes that you need to be aware of. And now I'm going to go through them in a bit more detail and how you make sure you're collecting them. So I'll start with probably the easiest, which is sales revenue. As I said, essentially, as soon as you upload your music to a distributor or an aggregator, you are, in that respect, giving them a license to manage your copyrights, and you have an agreement that they will pay a certain percentage of income. As we said, we know with a lot of the fee-paying ones that you will actually get 100% of the income back. You may notice this often comes up that if you if you've licensed your music to a distributor and then you try and upload it on YouTube, it will say that somebody else has the rights to that. Well, that's because you've given them the rights when it has been distributed. There's no real problem with this. That's how they're helping you make money, but it does involve you essentially giving them the license to monetize it. I do always want to mention at this point is that, again, when you license a distributor, you're giving them permission to distribute on the main, what we call DSPs, so things like Spotify, but that often doesn't include what we call direct to fan sales, of the most common of which is on Bandcamp, which you can do directly. And that obviously works differently. You set the prices and earn revenue direct, and it's also useful for acquiring customer data. One thing that's important to mention about this way is, I've already mentioned with streaming services how there is an income there for the songwriters. Bandcamp and most direct-to-fan platforms don't get involved in that. The idea is that you will pay for that through the physical records, like I used in the example earlier. So it's just one thing to be mindful of. I'm not going to go into it in too much detail on in this session, but it's just something to be mindful that if you are selling works that involve other people's songs through direct-to-fan, that you need to make sure that you are doing the right things there. The other way, of course, in which your music can get released is with a label. So potentially a similar situation to working with a distributor. But just like with a distributor, if you're working with a label, even if it's informal, it's important to understand a few terms in terms of who is going to take on various responsibilities. Because again, you're probably aware that a record label can work in a really wide variety of ways. There can be really, really formal record deals with multinational companies, and there could be friends just trying to help each other out. And as I said, whichever way it is, whether there's a formal contract or just a general understanding, it's really worth understanding some of these terms. So some of the ones that we would recommend is who becomes the master rights holder. So again, if are you going to remain, is the person, if you made the recording, are you going to remain the master rights holder? And then who's collecting that income through PPL, like we'll talk about in more detail later? Is that, if you're going to let the label become the master rights holder, is that just for a certain period of time? Will you get that back in 3, 5, 10 years? What does that mean? Important thing to ask. How long do they get to manage the recordings, as in like host it for streaming? Again, if you're not aware, traditionally in the record industry, this was forever. But nowadays, agreements can be as little as 12 months, 3 years, and even longer term deals can only be 5 to 10 years. You may be aware there are a number of prominent acts over the last 20 years where they only had kind of like 10-year deals. So the rights are reverting back to the artist. So again, even if you're just working with a friend, it's worth thinking about what the time scale is if you're going to give them this music forever, or if after a certain period of time you can kind of have the rights back to decide what you want to do with them. And then how long is the agreement for releasing through them? By which I mean, is it just for one release, or are you saying for the next year I'm going to release with this label? Again, a traditional record label is in a kind of major label, big indie. They would always sign you for a period of time. It wouldn't be on a release by release basis. Whereas obviously a kind of smaller friends label might just be like, oh, I like this record, I want to help you release it. So again, it's really worth being clear. That one is much harder to pin down unless it's in a formal contract. All the others can be problematic if you've not discussed them. That third one generally wouldn't have a leg to stand on unless it was in an actual contract, but it is still worth broaching. Then, of course, the final one is, what is the royalty percentage on income? So they're going to distribute your music. What are you getting back after that? And again, a lot of kind of small indie labels will do it on a 50-50 basis. They'll give you back 50%, probably after some costs. A more traditional record deal might be anywhere between 10 and 20% of the total income. So the record label will retain a lot of that, but also the expectation is at that point is that they start putting a lot of money into it to pay for whether it's marketing or recording and so on. Okay, so that's the kind of record sales bit. So as I said, I probably the simplest bit. The complications come where there's more third parties like record labels. So neighboring rights next. So this is related to the recordings still. This is what we're going to focus on at this point. So this is a piece of UK copyright law. It says that performers and the owners of recordings have the right to payment when the works are publicly performed. That means when the recordings are played out in public. Piece of law called equitable remuneration. And I kind of make note of that sort of official name for it because it's often used in contracts and things like that. The main way in which recordings are broadcast or publicly performed is through TV and radio. Of course, they are sometimes played in clubs, in cafes and bars as well. That generates a really, really tiny amount of income. Really, we're talking about making the most out of neighbouring rights when the songs are played on TV and radio. And in the UK, these royalties are collected and administered by an organisation called PPL. Quite confusingly, these rights, these royalties have a few different names. So they're sometimes called performer royalties or master rights royalties. I try and use the term neighbouring rights because it sounds a lot less like the other ones. Performer royalties sounds a lot like performing royalties. And those can be two different things. Performing royalties is typically what PRS collects, do songwriting. So I like to call them neighbouring rights. So I will generally refer to them as neighbouring rights or the royalties collected by PPL. So PPL pay royalties out for recordings registered on their systems to the performers and the rights hold 50-50. So they split them in two. Okay. So if your recordings are registered on for PPL, then they will pay 50% out to all the performers and then 50% out to who the rights holders are. And that information is sat on PPL's database. Now, the bit that's really, really important is that only rights holders can register a recording in PPL. And the reason that's important is because you need different types of accounts to register things on PPL. Now, there's nothing to stop. It's quite easy to set up a master rights account on PPL, relatively. But you need to know that you need to do that. And again, from our experience at Launchpad, and I'll talk a little bit about the work we do with Launchpad Plus as we go along, where we do a lot of these services to help emerging artists, is they don't realize that they need different types of accounts. They don't quite work out what they have to do. Everyone gets frustrated and a lot of money ends up not being collected. But anyone can set up a master rights account as well as a performer account. So again, using the example of a solo electronic producer on his laptop, he's everything. He's recording it, writing it, performing it. He would need two different accounts to get all his money from PPL. He would need his master rights account and his performer account. And he would need to register it first with the master rights account before he can collect the money as the performer. How do you register them? Once you've got your accounts, it's pretty easy. Essentially, all the recordings are identified by something called an ISRC code. You will, if you've released your music before through distributors, you will have been given an ISRC when your music was distributed. Basically, any recording that is on Spotify or other streaming services has to have an ISRC code. So you will have them. And that is what you need to be able to kind of uniquely identify your recording and make sure you're getting paid. Yes, I mentioned that. In terms of setting up your accounts through PPL, I've mentioned that you would need two accounts, but the thing is that they are free. So again, as I said, it is pretty easy with a caveat to set up, and there is nothing to stop you. It's free to sign up both. Again, what we find a lot of people have trouble is that the forms are quite faffy, I'm afraid to say. You generally need to print, you fill out a form online, but then it makes you print them out so you can sign them and then scan them back in. In addition to that, you also need to scan in proof of signature and proof of address. So generally a driving license works really well. But also, it also asks if you want them to collect your royalties worldwide. And if that includes the US, well, worldwide obviously does include the US, but by including the US, you need to fill out another tax form to confirm your business status in the US, which again involves printing out a form, signing it, and filling it back in. And again, we've witnessed the process a lot of times that people just sort of lose faith in that whole process. It is worth doing. We can help you. We proactively do it through Launchpad Plus. Actually, the PPL team themselves are really good. If you're trying to do it themselves, they are really open to questions and helping to troubleshoot. But yes, it is. Having said it's easy, it's not that easy to get through. But do persevere, because there can be money at the end. And unlike other things that we're going to look at, it is free. And as I said here, again, it is something that we proactively work with Launchpad Plus, which I'll talk about a bit at the end if you need specific help doing so. Ultimately, if you are, what we found is if you are getting national airplay, so if recordings that you've performed on, that you're releasing, are getting played on Six Music, Radio 1 Extra, that is a decent amount of income and is well worth making sure that you're chasing it. The other bit that I haven't included here is that, unlike PRS, which we'll talk about in a minute, it is not that easy to backdate. You can only really backdate PPL to the beginning of the calendar year, to around 6 months. So unlike PRS, where you can go back and claim, like already now, for anything that had airplay in 2022, it is unlikely that that money will be able to be claimed because of the way that the licensing system works. So it is really, really worth getting on top of. Oh, and finally, just a little note about this type of royalty called equitable remuneration is that, again, you might notice that it doesn't actually occur when your music is streamed on DSPs, so streaming services like Spotify, etc. There is a note there to say that this is a live conversation in multiple parts of the world about whether it should be. So just to say that it isn't a royalty now doesn't mean it won't be in 3 to 5 years. So again, more reasons, if you are going to be making music for the foreseeable future, to make sure that you are collecting all the money you should be. Okay, now on to what we collectively call publishing royalties. Now, again, I realize I'm throwing around quite a lot of descriptive words today, and I am trying to be consistent, and I know that is one of the biggest problems in trying to understand that. But publishing royalties are collectively the terms that we mean to refer to the royalties related to songwriters. And as previously mentioned, they're split in two, between performing royalties and mechanical royalties. So first of all, we're going to talk about performing royalties. This is the thing that you're probably most familiar with. These are the royalties that are collected by PRS. And they are generated when songs and compositions are broadcast, which means performed live in public, played on TV, and streamed through DSPs. So very similar to what PPL collects, except this is for the composers and songwriters, not the performers and the rights holders. And because of that, there is a much broader term to what it means. So number one, like if a live band performed them, that wouldn't work in the same way with PPL because it's a recording. So you playing them in a pub and a gig, your own songs, that generates PRS. And also, as I just mentioned, PRS is also generated when the music is streamed. So you can either sign up with PRS to collect this money, or you can work with a publisher. If you're not familiar with the term publisher, in music terms, a publisher kind of acts like a record label, but for your song, for your compositions, as opposed to your recordings. And I'll talk a little bit more about what a publisher does when I've kind of run through what these royalties are. So what royalties are generated in this way? So live. Essentially, all live music venues have to pay a license to PRS, okay? And if you are playing a small gig, so like a 50 to 100 capacity pub, they pay a regular fee to PRS. And for every gig they have on, they will pay £10 of PRS to all the songwriters combined. So if you are the only person performing and you've played entirely your own songs, you would be due £10 from PRS. If it is an open mic night and 10 people have played, then you might get £1 of that if it's all your own compositions. If someone's done a Beatles cover set, the Beatles get £10 because they have they were the songwriters of the songs that were combined. Once you start getting to larger gigs with tickets, it starts getting split a bit differently. Where this line is very, very blurry. There is no kind of fixed way to work out what is a gig that pays £10 and what is a gig where it's a percentage of ticket price. One thing's for sure is once the tickets start going over, say, £10, that starts becoming the 4.2% of ticket income. And in that respect, that is where a promoter then audits it back to PRS and they charge them a fee. So again, if there's £1,000 in ticket fees, then £42 will go to into PRS, of which, as it says here, 80% of that money will go to the headliner and 20% to the support acts. Now, as you can imagine, as soon as you start talking about academy gigs, university gigs, arena gigs, that 4.2% can be huge. So, you know, £100,000 in ticket sales is a small fry for an arena show. That would pay out over £4,000 in ticketed income. If whatever way you're doing is, the way you can make sure you're getting paid for this is to submit your set list and what gigs you've played through the PRS website. That is how you make sure you're getting your live performing royalties. What does this mean when you're getting paid on radio? Well, handily, all the latest breakdowns of how much money is generated through radio play is on the PRS website for you to look. These are some of the latest figures. So if you're getting played on Radio 1, if it's an evening show, you'll be getting £4.50 per minute, so about £15 per play. If it's in prime time, so on the breakfast show, you'd be getting more like £30 to £40 per play. And obviously that's it's slightly different depending on the radio station. So 1Extra and 6 Music, you might be getting £10 a play to £20 a play, but on regional radio, that's really quite it drops quite significantly. So on Radio Leeds, so an evening show on Radio Leeds would be about 11p a minute. So if you're getting paid on BBC Introducing in West Yorkshire and same in South Yorkshire and in Humberside, it's probably about 30 or 40p for each play, but it's all your money. And it all adds up together. As previously mentioned, streaming DSPs, so Spotify, Apple, etc., also pay performing royalties when the music is streamed, which is 9% of that total amount. Do you remember from earlier? So if you are paid all 100% of your money from distributors, there's about another 10%, the way it scales, that you're missing by not, if you're not signed up to PRS and not registering your songs on there. So again, even if you're getting your money from sales, there is more money to come through performing royalties and PRS. So the snip with PRS is it's £100 to join. And that does take quite a while to add up. It's also £100 per songwriter. So for example, if you're a band of 4 people and you all write the songs and you're going to split that equally, you need to join 4 times in order to collect all that money, which would obviously be £400. Good thing is, it's that for life, right? Once you joined, you're still a member. I joined 20 years ago, still a member, still receive royalties when my music's played. And you can see here of some examples of the amount of plays that you might need to kind of regenerate that £100. But I would say if you're gigging a lot, it's definitely worth doing. If you're committed to doing music, it's definitely worth doing. So taking performing royalties to a side and going over to this thing called mechanical royalties. Now, I'm probably spoil what I'm about to put on the slides in a minute. The thing about mechanical royalties is 20, 30 years ago and beyond, it was a really, really important part for songwriters in terms of how they got paid in relation to record sales as a songwriter. And then for, I would say, 5, 10 to 20 years, in recent times, it's been much, much less important. That is starting to change because of this playback thing, and specifically with radio. So we are starting to see more and more mechanical royalties coming through. So as I said, mechanical royalties are collected by an organisation called the MCPS in the UK. Traditionally, they were generated when compositions were duplicated, when CDs and vinyls were pressed. They still are generated through that. And they're also generated when music is streamed through DSPs. And now we're starting to see more income generated when songs are duplicated through radio playback, specifically through the BBC. As we've already said, they're a chunky way to for songwriters for recorded music sales. So if someone was going to sell, 100,000 albums, so take Elton John and Bernie Taupin, classic songwriting duo, as an example, this would be how Bernie Taupin got paid. Essentially, he would get 50% of the MCPS from that huge amount of records that were pressed through this mechanical license. On an emerging level, that volume doesn't really happen in that way. And so those small amounts become less of a thing. Got a question in the chat there going, is it generated at the point it's pressed, even if no sales are made? So technically, yes, when it comes to physical records, when you press a physical record, the pressing plant should ask for a documentation to say who are the songwriters, and then you have to, depending on how it's structured, you will have to go and pay MCPS and get a license. That's what it's called. Get a license to give them permission to press it, or they will do that for you. So you're probably aware that doesn't happen that often, especially at a smaller level. Not a lot of pressing companies kind of ask for that license. But what I will say is, so this is slightly interesting in terms of when it happens. If a record is successful, MCPS will go to the record label if there is no evidence of a license happening, and obviously MCPS you have to go to them to get the license. If there's no evidence of a license, they will come to you and ask for a license retrospectively. That is what happened with my record label 20 years ago. We started out super DIY. We did a compilation of 20 local artists. A number of them went on to become quite successful, signed publishing deals, and then we started getting chased for, £100 here, there for the mechanical license for the CD that we had pressed. So it's just something to be aware of, really. In fact, I think I've got another slide here which talks about how it works at a grassroots level. A lot of indie labels, where it's quite DIY, will ask the artist to waive the mechanical royalty. So where the performing artist is also the songwriter, you can kind of get away with, asking them to waive that based on record sales they'll get, and also giving them stock instead of the mechanical license, instead of it going to MCPS and back to the songwriters. If the artist is the songwriter, you can come to an agreement quite often where they get stock to sell instead and keep the money instead of it going to MCPS. Again, even on a grassroots level, if you've done a cover, again, that's where it can become a bit dodgy, and MCPS can come and chase for you there. And there's a bit, as with last week, I'll send a copy of these slides around to everyone registered afterwards, and you can see what some of the links say. So just going back to the question, does it cost to get a license? Yes, it is about, I've got a slide in a minute. It is what they call 8.5% of the RRP of the record. So if you're going to sell the record to shops for £10 on the basis they'll then sell it more. No, not the RRP, sorry, the distributed price. The price to distributors, then if you were going to do £10, it would be 85p of each copy that they would ask for, and that would then get split between all the songwriters on the record. So if it's like a 20-track compilation, that gets split in a lot of different ways. If it's a 4-track 12-inch, it would get split least ways. Just going back from the physical for a minute, again, the important point to make is that you do, as well as I keep mentioning about radio playback, you do get mechanical royalties for streaming as well. This is on top of the performing royalties. So you get another 9% of that total. So again, if you're not collecting your PRS, and if you're everything, if you're the songwriter and the recording artist and you're distributing it, if you're not collecting your PRS and you're not collecting your MCPS, then you are missing out on money that is due to you. So I mentioned this before, mechanical royalties don't happen when songs are broadcast live on radio, but the streams that count as playback, they do. The same counts for moving image. So again, if your songs are used on TV programs, but they're broadcast later, that does also generate a mechanical license. So here we go. Here's the slide I was looking at. So in terms of some of the details. So the kicker is the MCPS is also £100 to join. So again, if you're an individual, to join PRS and MCPS is a total of £200. If you're a collective group band of 4 people, then it could be £800 to join both and to make sure you are getting everything. But again, they are for you as an individual and they are for life. I would say that the mechanical royalties, it's much harder to equate what you are, how much you are due, how much you might possibly earn, unless you get a co-write on a big record that has lots of pressed copies, which is what the MCPS license is related to. Okay, so sitting on top of performing royalties and mechanical royalties is publishing agreements. So I've already said that all these royalties related to songwritings are sorry, I keep getting distracted by questions. I'm going to come to the question in a minute. Sitting on top of your performing royalties and mechanical royalties, collectively we call them publishing, and there are these companies called publishers who act as a who basically collect your PRS and MCPS for you. And just like a record label, in the slide I did earlier about what the terms are for a record label, you need to know what a publisher can do and what agreements you'll be getting into place with them. Now, one of the things that is becoming common in publishers are what's called administration deals, of which you may well be aware of a company called Centric, which does a lot of these. I'm going to break them down in a minute. Now, the reason I mention that right now is we've got another question in the chat, which is, if I join MCPS now, how far back can I claim royalties? Now, I have to be honest, I'm not 100% sure of this, but from what I'm aware of, is if those that MCPS has been claimed, you should be able to go back as in like they've been paid into MCPS, then you can go back at least 3 years, if not up to 5 to 7 years. You have to check that. But if you have been represented by a publisher, they will have been collecting them for you as well. So I'll go through that a bit now, and maybe that's a question we can follow up at the end after the recording as well. So, as I've just said some of this, traditionally you might sign a publishing agreement to collect your performing and mechanical royalties. That's what a publishing does for kind of bigger artists. Because of that, many established artists and songwriters actually never sign up to MCPS direct, because as soon as they start becoming successful, traditionally, their publishing company collects all the MCPS for them. The reason it doesn't work the same for PRS is because of the copyright law again, is that even if whatever publishing deal you sign, the songwriters always have to retain 50% of the publishing income. This is called the writer's share. So a big band, a publisher will collect 100% of the MCPS for the songwriter and 50% of the PRS, but leave 50% of the PRS that will always go directly into the performer's bank accounts. And that is the same with administration publishing deals as well. But similarly, if you're not signed up to either PRS or MCPS, the publishing company can collect 100% of all of it. So again, if you are signed up, if you are signed up to a publisher or a publishing administrator, but you aren't signed up to PRS MCPS, the good news is they can collect everything for you. So this can be a way around those £100 fees for PRS and MCPS. So as with recording agreements, it's really important to understand what the nature of the agreement is that you are entering if you're working with a publisher or a publishing administrator. So as with record labels, the first one is, how long is the agreement for managing the compositions? So how long do they get to manage the compositions for? So again, a big publishing company like Sony or Universal or Warner Chappell, that could be up to 20 years or beyond. As I said, traditionally, that would be what's called in perpetuity, forever. Now it is often less. Sweet spot, top end maybe 20, but maybe even less. And after that, they would manage them for that amount of time. and then it would revert back to the original composers. Do you still need to collect parts of your royalty? So are they collecting? I said they would collect 100% of both. It's worth checking that. They should be worth checking. Again, a big part of making sure that you're getting all your royalties is submitting your live music claims. Now, radio play is pretty automated because of the way it works, especially with BBC Radio. It's really, really, really well reported. Live music absolutely isn't. It's a bit of a mess. So if you want to make sure that you're getting all the money you are eligible for when your songs are performed live, you need to be really proactive about submitting claims for which gigs you've done. So again, if you're working with a third party, a publisher, you need to know how they're doing that and how you tell them. And then finally, just like with record labels, what percentage are you getting? Now, unlike record labels where I talked about a split being a common split being 50-50, and maybe if you're working with a major label or a huge indie, it would be closer to kind of 20%. Well, actually, it's very rare for you to get less than 70% on a publishing deal, even a major label publishing deal. So 70% is kind of the floor. 80% is pretty good, really. So they're only likely to be taking 15, 20, 30% at max of your publishing cut. But again, you need to know that and you need to be clear about what the expectations are. So as mentioned, there is a rise. So, a traditional publisher, like I keep mentioning the majors, just like there are major labels, there are major publishers and major publishing companies. But just like there is with distributors, there is a rise in what we call publishing collection services that will collect all your PRS and MCPS income without a fee, but for a percentage. So typically around 20%. And sometimes they have added benefits, like they can pitch for sync as well. Now, just going on about the terms before, many of them are really short term. In fact, you can leave them if you get a better deal. They sit on top of PRS and MCPS. So if you're not signed up to them, they will collect all your income. If you are signed up to them, they'll kind of collect around it. They would collect they would collect all of it apart from that writer's share that I was mentioning above. So I've mentioned them already, but the most common company that does this, I think, in the UK is Centric. I've mentioned Launchpad Plus a few times before. We also offer this as well as something we do, and we currently publish about 40 to 50 artists in this way. Again, through a combination of helping artists who aren't signed up to PRS and MCPS, or helping them that do just PRS to make sure they're getting their MCPS as well. And I'll mention that. I'll talk a bit more about Launchpad Plus when we finish today. So that's kind of your major breakdown. There's a few final notes really before I kind of wrap up this bit of the session. When you sign up to PRS and PPL, and when you register your music on them, you are basically offering them a blanket license to have your music broadcast in the UK. That's what it is. I said this kind of at the start. It's nothing to worry about, but it is worth being aware again that essentially the process of registering them is giving them permission to use your music so they can collect that music. And that counts for other people performing it live in pubs. That counts for it being played on the radio. That counts for it being used on terrestrial TV, okay? And you register the music to them so they can make sure that you, as the songwriters, composers, performers, and rights holders, all get your income. That is the premise of what PRS and PPL is. Just a quick mention for sync, because a lot of people are very interested in sync. If you're not aware of what sync is, it is the process where the producers of visual media, so primarily TV, film, games, adverts, can pay the owner of a recording and a song for a license to put that against the images. So typical example would be getting your song put into an advert. They have to pay a fee for that. It is different to this blanket license that I just mentioned. As soon as it's for like sale on DVD or used to sell something like an advert, as soon as it's not public broadcast, they have to pay a fee. And this is something that a lot of artists are really keen to get into. It can be quite lucrative. Certainly most sync fees start at 4 figures. Most of them are in 5 figures. Beatles, artists like that can command ones of £500,000 or £1 million. But they obviously are quite rare to get. The other thing about sync is that because most of the time it is a combination of a recording rights holder and the songwriters, it needs agreement so that both the master rights holder, the record label, and the publishing company, the composers, need to agree on it, and they also need to agree on the fee. Otherwise, it can often cause issues. Now, if it's being broadcast as well, you will also continue to get things like PRS and MCPS and PPL. If it's used on a TV program like a HBO series, if it's broadcast in the UK, you would get that. Obviously, it's a video game that isn't publicly broadcast, so you wouldn't get those fees then. Okay, so kind of gone through quite a lot there, and hopefully that feels relatively clear. A few tips for making sure that you are sorted. Hopefully, you've gone through where all the different organizations are and what royalties they correspond to. Video will be up on YouTube shortly. The slides I will also send round to you, so you can refer back to them all the time. But some tips: keep a record of your repertoire. So what recordings and what songs you've written and registered. What are the codes to them? What are the ISRC codes for the recordings? And it might be useful to have the tune codes for the compositions. That's the equivalent for the songwriting. If you're working with any third party, be clear about who's doing what and for how long and who's registering what. One of the biggest things that we've seen through supporting artists with Launchpad is people working with independent record labels who aren't registering the master rights on PPL. That means that no matter who should have done, it means the performers can't go back and claim their share of it. And in fact, again, I mentioned with Launchpad Plus, part of what we've done with Launchpad Plus has actually been to work with labels to make sure that those master rights are getting registered. And across all of this, if you are writing and performing and recording, make sure that you are getting everything possible. And again, through Launchpad Plus, we can help you audit that. We can help put stuff in place to collect anything that you might not be doing. And because you can always ask for help. And again, not just through us, PRS and PPL are actually super, super helpful, and you can always put queries in through them. So thanks for this session. Couple more notes. If you do have any questions, don't forget you can always book one-to-one advice sessions from our team through the website. And a final note is properly on Launchpad Plus. So all the things we've talked about today are really, really common issues that we find with most art, if not all the artists, not all of them actually, most of them that come through the Launchpad support. So we created another program called Launchpad Plus, which supports releasing music and royalty collection. And through that, we talked a bit last week that we can help with distributing your music, that supports the releasing that we did last week, talked about last week, but it also, I spend a lot of my time trying to make sure that all the royalties are getting collected. And I said how helpful PRS and PPL are. We've got really good relationships with them where we often kind of go back and forth, making sure that everything is sorted. If anyone hasn't looked at that, again, I know people on the call have looked at that. If you can look at that on our website, you can book a meeting with us specifically to talk about Launchpad Plus, and we can send you some details over of that. We currently, as I said, I think we look after about 40 or 50 artists when it comes to publishing now, and an increasing number of artists managing their PPL affairs as well, just to make sure that it's all sorted, because the benefit we have is that we're kind of in this, we do so much that we're in the system all the time, so we're starting to realize which bits don't work as well as they should, so that we need to kind of jiggle them along. So that's it for today. Thank you very much for your time. I'm going to stop the recording now, and if anyone else on the call wants to ask any other questions, with cameras on, mics on, that'd be great. But for those of you watching back on this video on YouTube, thanks a lot. Cheers.